It is January 1st. Dan sits at his desk, opens a crisp new notebook, and writes down the exact same resolution millions of people write. This is the year I make six figures. Dan subscribes to the software, watches 30 hours of business advice on YouTube, and waits for inspiration to strike like lightning. But by December, Dan is sitting in the exact same spot, exhausted, confused, and poorer than when he started. Why? Because Dan was playing a game with the wrong rulebook. When people say, make $100K in 12 months, Dan's brain immediately defaulted to Hollywood math. He pictured drop-shipping cheap gadgets from overseas, launching a viral crypto coin, or grinding 20 hours a day until he collapsed. Dan romanticized the hustle, but he completely ignored the cold, hard math.
Let's look at the actual arithmetic Dan had to face. $100,000 sounds like an intimidating monolith, a mountain to scale in one giant leap. But watch what happens when Dan chops it down. $100,000 in a year isn't a mountain. It's $8,333 a month. Break that down further, it's roughly $2,083 a week. Or if Dan looked at it daily, weekends included, it's about $274 a day. Suddenly, the dragon didn't look so terrifying. Dan didn't need a viral miracle. Dan didn't need venture capital. Dan needed a system. If Dan woke up tomorrow with $0, no connections, and a strict 12-month deadline to clear $100K net, Dan wouldn't try to build the next Amazon. Dan wouldn't chase passive income. Dan would follow a 3-phase blueprint built entirely on high-leverage skills, radical focus, and solving expensive problems. Let's walk through exactly how Dan would do it.
Month 1 to 3 is what Dan calls the desperation detox and skill stack. Dan almost made a fatal mistake that most beginners make, trying to sell a product before possessing an asset. But when you have no money, your primary asset isn't capital, it's your capability. Dan needed to learn a skill that businesses are actively bleeding money trying to solve. What are businesses losing sleep over in the current economy? Attention, conversion, and operational friction. If Dan could walk into a local business or an e-commerce brand and say, I can help you make more money or save more time, Dan instantly becomes valuable. But Dan couldn't just say it, he had to prove it. During these first 90 days, Dan didn't spend a single dime on a fancy logo, website, or LLC. Dan locked himself in a room and mastered one high-leverage digital skill. Let's pick short-form video growth and copywriting as Dan's weapon of choice. Every modern brand, from local real estate agents to software startups, needs short-form content to survive on TikTok, Instagram Reels, and YouTube Shorts. Yet 90% of business owners are too busy, too old school, or too lazy to do it right.
Dan spent 2 hours a day studying hooks, pacing, retention algorithms, and direct response copywriting. Dan spent the other 4 hours practicing by editing videos and writing scripts for free for local creators. Why free? Because social proof is Dan's currency in the beginning. By the end of month 3, Dan hadn't made much money, but Dan had 3 stellar case studies. Real proof that says Dan took this business's views from 0 to 50,000, and it brought them 3 new clients. With that proof in hand, Dan knew the playing field had changed completely. Now, Dan enters phase 2, the hunting season, months 4 through 8.
This is where most people fail because they suffer from freelancer panic. They charge $500 a client, take on 10 different projects, burn out, and quit. That is a recipe for a miserable job, not a business. And Dan knew better. Let's look back at Dan's target, $8,333 a month. If Dan charged $500 a month for his services, Dan would need 17 clients to hit his goal. Managing 17 clients by yourself is a logistical nightmare. Client churn will eat you alive. Instead, Dan uses high-ticket value packaging. Dan wouldn't sell video editing. Dan would sell a growth system. Dan pitches a complete package, 8 high-performing short-form videos a month, optimized scripts, and engagement strategy for $2,000 a month.
Let's run that math again. At $2,000 a client, How many clients does Dan need to hit $8,333 a month? 4. Just 4 clients. 4 businesses in the entire United States that trust Dan to handle their short-form media. That's it. Dan doesn't need 1 million followers. Dan doesn't need a massive email list. Dan needs 4 relationships built on trust and results. How does Dan get them? Not by spamming cold emails with generic templates. Dan uses the Loom video audit strategy. Dan finds 50 businesses in a growing niche, say financial advisors, fitness coaches, or SaaS founders. Dan records a personalized 3-minute Loom video pointing out one glaring mistake in their current social media strategy and shows them how to fix it for free. Dan gives them the value up front. Out of 50, 10 reply. Out of 10, 4 say yes to a call. Out of those 4, Dan closes 2.
Boom!
Dan just secured his first $4,000 a month. Dan is halfway to his goal, and he only works with 2 people. By month 9, Dan is making a steady $4,000 to $6,000 a month. Dan is no longer starving, but Dan is hitting a physical ceiling. There are only 24 hours in a day, and if Dan keeps editing all those videos himself, Dan has just built himself a stressful job with a bad boss, himself. This is where phase 3 begins for Dan: arbitrage and scale. To cross the finish line to 100K, Dan has to transition from a freelancer to an agency owner. Dan takes that $2,000 monthly retainer from his clients, and instead of pocketing it all, Dan reinvests a portion into labor arbitrage. Dan goes to Upwork, Twitter, or specialized creative communities and finds a talented, hungry video editor overseas who charges $600 a month to do the heavy lifting.
Dan becomes the quality control filter. Dan manages the client relationship, handles the strategy, and lets his editor handle execution. Suddenly, Dan's capacity triples. Dan scales his client roster from 4 to 8. At 8 clients paying $2,000 a month, Dan's gross monthly revenue jumps to $16,000. Even after paying his editors and minor overhead, Dan's net profit easily clears the $8,333 monthly threshold needed to hit that coveted $100,000 milestone by month 12. Dan didn't do it by gambling on crypto. Dan didn't do it by waiting for luck. Dan did it through an unglamorous, predictable staircase of skill acquisition, high-ticket positioning, and smart delegation. Dan's first 100K wasn't about genius. It was about execution stamina. The roadmap is right there. The tools are free. The internet doesn't care who you are or where you came from. It only rewards value. So what are you waiting for? Take a page out of Dan's book. Your first 12 months start today.
Thank you so much for watching. And I hope you have an incredible time recharging over the break.